All right guys, we're coming back to carbon ceramics. This is why your carbon ceramics are still squeaking, especially if you've already tried the Burnish burn-off process. All right, so I made the first video about carbon ceramic squeaking. I was focused more on the rotors because the rotors are an issue that we don't know about how long they're actually going to last. But something that I got a ton of comments on is, Micah, I did your burn off procedure and it works for a day or two and then the squeaking comes back. Why? What's going on? So today we're gonna cover what is causing the brakes to squeak outside of a rotor being damaged. All right, first thing to keep in mind is that there are two different types of squeaks that we're talking about here. They sound very similar, but they are distinctly different in that the carbon ceramic heat cycle failure squeal is like nails on a chalkboard. It's intolerable. It bothers the people around you. The other type of squeak, it sounds very squeaky, very similar, but it's not as loud. Now, this is common for any brake system, but especially for carbon ceramics. Due to the advanced mileage that you're getting out of carbon ceramics, you may not change the pads. In the case of the guy that just came today, 25,000 miles, and he still had over half of the pad remaining. His plan was to continue driving on them, but in that time he's been through multiple car washes, he's driven through dirty roads, he's had the GM technicians put way too much grease on his pads, and so debris from the road, grease from Armor All causes a bunch of dirt and debris to build up on the slide points. Now this causes squeaking. One thing you should know about these carbon ceramic rotors are there should be no grease applied to the pad, none. If you wanted to, you could apply it to the back of the pad where the caliper presses into it, but really do not need to put grease there either. Even in the pad instructions, it says to put a thin layer of grease on the slide points. I have never done this, not ever. If you clean it and polish it, none of my clients come back with noise. If you do want to put some grease there, it has to be so thin that it just leaves a shine to the material. You should not be able to see any grease off of the pad. So no clumps, no little streaks. It should just be a shiny edge area. And the reason for this is if you have excess grease there, brake dust gets generated by the pad, goes right into that grease, the grease catches it and holds it, and then the heat cycle bakes it and it turns into cement, and that inhibits its ability to slide. On this Corvette, especially Corvettes, they're gonna have this problem because GM techs are just not used to dealing with supercars. They slather grease on there. Remember how I said don't use grease on the pads? So look at all this grease everywhere. Look at all this grease.
Yeah, that's from the
factory
dealership.
guys.
Yeah.
And in this case, the inner pad was wearing much less than the outer pad. It had gotten jammed up by this concrete solution, and it was cutting the life of his pads shorter if he'd been tracking it. Obviously, it doesn't matter, he wore them out with plenty of pad material left. But what I'm saying is you'll be cutting your pad life down. You don't need to apply any grease at all. Just make sure it's super clean and that grease has nowhere to stick, and you'll have a very long life with no squeaks. A normal pad on a steel rotor would be changed every 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 miles. They would then be cleaned and inspected and reassembled properly, and those squeaks wouldn't be there. So if you hear a low volume squeaking, that usually is the problem. Just take the pads off, clean them, and put them back on. Now this is only going to be applicable to vehicles with very low miles, like 2 to 3 to 7,000 miles, but done over a long period of time. Next, we're going to talk about the loud carbon ceramic low heat cycle failure squeal, the one that is unmistakable. It was in the beginning of my last video, just extremely nails on a chalkboard. Now, this is also due to a low heat cycle failure, but not always the rotor. So you see, the pads are also going through low heat cycles. Now, you may be thinking, Micah, my car goes through heat cycles every time I start it and drive it. Why doesn't the plastic hoses in the radiator fail or other softer components fail if what you're saying is true? The reason for that is that your engine, once it's got to engine operating temperature, it maintains that temperature until you turn the car off. That's one big heat cycle. But your brake pads are going from very low ambient temperature to 600, 800 degrees Fahrenheit, then back down to 200 degrees, and then 800 and back and forth every time you apply the brakes. So you're going through multiple very high shock heat cycles. Nothing in your car gets to 800 degrees outside of the brake system. So this high heat cycle does cause the rotors as well as the pads to become more tensile or more brittle. As the heat cycles happen, it heat hardens and they become brittle. I had a client come in today and he said, I watched your videos, I came from Florida, I want you to see if you can fix my problem. And I told him before he came, hey, you got 25,000 miles on the pads, your pads are no good. You have to replace them. He was telling me, and this is the same thing that a lot of people are asking me is, hey, when I do the burn off procedure, the noise goes away for a few days, but then comes back. That's because the entire pad is heat cycled, but only the face of it is bad enough to cause the squealing. So you get them hot, you burn off that face, but the material that is revealed after you burn that off is only slightly more healthy than that original face that you burnt off. It only takes a couple of days before it reaches that same tensile strength and begins to crumble. I removed the pads and we did see that. We saw.
Okay, so if you look right here on the pad, you can see these little pock marks. And you can see they start here and then it leaves a streak. Wherever the pock marks are, there's a streak that follows. Now here is at the top of the rotor, so the material is able to get away and get out. But here it gets trapped, and these little pock marks are where little crumbling pad from the edge and from brittle pad crumble get caught and then get trapped in the braking surface, and they leave these little pock marks when you try to brake. And that's what the squealing sound is. It's the nails on the chalkboard. So on this case, you can do that burnish procedure and remove this brittle layer. But after this pad has had 28,000 miles on it, the whole pad has gone through heat cycles. And so when you remove this, the noise goes away for a day or two because you remove the worst pad, but underneath it is just a slightly better material that very quickly gets to the same condition. So unfortunately, there's just time to replace the pad.
So if you have a car with 20,000 miles, 25,000 miles on the pads, that car today was only 4 years old. It does not matter. That pad has heat cycle failed and is no good. So you have to replace it. And once you do that, noise will go away. The rotor, again, as long as it's healthy, will probably allow you to drive without the squeal. The last video I made was more about, hey, we don't know when these rotors are going to become so brittle that they fail. If you buy a 2004 Porsche GT3 and you think you can go track it after 60,000 miles and 17 years, you're likely in for a big surprise.